to be here today. Thank you so much for spending your Wednesday afternoon with us. My name is Cindy Maravich, and I am the Senior Environmental Educator here at Inniswood Metro Gardens. And I am coming to you from Inniswood in our library here at the Innis House, which unfortunately is not open to visitors yet, but I figured I would sit among all of our horticulture books and talk to you about our topic for this afternoon. So I've been doing this kind of thing. I've been an educator for many, many years. This is my 13th year at Inniswood. So if you're familiar with programming at Inniswood, you have seen me before. So I'm happy to see so many familiar faces, and I'm really excited for people I haven't yet met. So thank you for joining us. This afternoon, my plan for this program is to talk about, because we are at the beginning of a year, this is the time when we start getting excited about gardening and about what our gardens are going to look like. So my plan for this afternoon is to kind of take us through the year. So we're going to talk about overall general things to keep in mind when planning your garden. And then we're going to kind of sprinkle in some information about pollinators. And I'm going to talk a lot about some plants that I really love that are super beneficial to pollinators and other critters. So that's what we'll do. I've divided things up by season. I could have done month by month because I'm kind of a task-oriented person. So my plan was to kind of do, hey, this month we do this and this and this. But as you know, if you live in Central Ohio or even in Ohio, planning things by months don't always work when it comes to gardening, because gardening can be very seasonal and that depends on our weather. So I'm just going to march through the 4 seasons and talk about different kinds of things you should keep in mind through each season. And we'll talk about some really cool plants that we've grown here at Inniswood, and different ways you can kind of reinvigorate or replan your garden for this year. Let me do. All right, so I'm going to figure out how to make sure that I can move forward. Here we go. All right. So we are marching through this year. We're technically this afternoon inching through this year, much like this little inchworm. And inchworms, as you may or may not know, are not really worms, but caterpillars. They actually turn into geometer moths, which are actually quite beautiful. And although geometer moths are not the most proficient pollinators, they're not the best at moving pollen, they can move pollen and they do visit flowers. So I thought this was an excellent way to start this year, because I don't know about you, but I'm entering the year a little bit more slowly than I did last year. So we're going to take it in a little bit of a recovery mode. All right, so when you think about planning your garden, I kind of look at it as, it's a how-to and it's a who for, right? So if you are thinking about, gosh, I'm not really sure, I've been a gardener for years, but I've never really grown vegetables, or I only grow vegetables because that's really all that matters to me. But I'm thinking, my neighbor has these really cool flowers, so maybe I should try that. So now's the time to think about those things, because I think one of two things happens. We either start out just growing stuff because we're excited and we see plants and we want to grow them, and we look at catalogs and we order all the things, and then we're not fully prepared to actually watch them grow and give them what they need. Or the opposite happens and we're like, what? We're going to do all containers this year, and we buy a bunch of containers and a bunch of supplies for it, and then we really don't follow through. So think about, in the end result, like, what are you doing? Who are you growing things for? And then how are you planning to do it? So what kind of space do you have? Are you interested in woody plants and shrubs, or you really want perennials? Have you always grown perennials, but you really want to try something else? I will say, though, whether you grow things to consume as food or not, I think plants should really work for you. I think they need to have multiple jobs. They're going to give us oxygen, of course, but really our plants need to be doing lots of stuff in the garden. And we can make that happen by choosing the right plants and really just, having those ultimate goals in mind. So you maybe want to think about growing more native plants. We've been talking about this for years. If you have any interest in gardening, you've heard this over and over, that these are really important. And that's because these plants, they know how to live here. This is where they're native to. I'm a native Ohioan. I know how to live in Ohio. I'm very adaptable to the climate and to the people. I get it here, right? Plants are the same. The common milkweed is something that I really love growing. People think it looks trashy, right? So maybe your goal is to how to incorporate something that doesn't look as pristine and pretty, but has a lot of great benefits. Maybe you're really interested in other types of wildlife. So you like plants, but really you started out just kind of doing some bird watching. So look at this beautiful girl right here. So this is the female eastern towhee. It's one of my most favorite birds. If you have no interest in plants whatsoever, most people would appreciate a small bird. This one's actually more robin size, but she loves to eat things that turn into pollinators or that are currently pollinating. So if you encourage pollinators, you're going to encourage beautiful birds like this one. And maybe you just want to, show off your mad gardening skills like my son did last summer. We grew lots and lots of tomato plants and got a full 3 great tomatoes. And look at that swagger. He's pumped, man. He was so excited for the very small amount of produce we produced that last year. But nonetheless, it was very exciting. So maybe that's your goal for the year. Of course, as I mentioned, I think plants need to work for you. And whether or not you're eating them or sharing them or, putting them out there for food for other types of wildlife, if you really think about it, most of the food we eat comes from something having to pollinate it. So the majority of the fruits you see here are pollinated mostly by some sort of bee. So whether they're bumblebees for tomatoes, honeybees for apples, mason and orchard bees for raspberries. There's a lot of squash bees that are important for pollinating our watermelons, pumpkins, and things in the squash family. So we really can't take that for granted. If you want to have tomatoes, then you probably need to be prepared to invite bumblebees to your garden because they're the things that are going to move the pollen so that you can get those fruits. So why do we even care about this pollination, right? It's a kind of a buzzword, if you will. We talk about it all the time. I don't know about you, but I've been hearing about it just as much as I hear about native plants. And why is this so important? Well, I'm going to say that pollination really, to me, is one of the most important events that happens in our world because majority of plants have pollen. And in order to get fruits that we eat that contain seeds that grow more plants, we got to move the pollen. So the pollen gets moved by a number of things. Most of the things are things we're familiar with, bees and butterflies, but even flies and ants and wasps are excellent pollinators of certain plants. And we can't forget about wind and water. I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of time with corn as a kid growing up on a farm. And those big tassels move that pollen pretty far when on a windy day. So wind is actually very important for some plants as well to move the pollen. So lots of different things to think about. It's actually a much bigger picture when you talk about pollination than just bees and butterflies. So we're going to start in winter. So here's some things to think about in winter, which is currently where we are. So if there's snow outside, which there isn't outside the window I'm looking at, but if there is, the snow can actually be very helpful. And again, if you have lived in Ohio, you know that snow actually is very much like a blanket and can sometimes make it seem a little bit warmer outside if there's a blanket of snow, hence the name blanket of snow. So keep that snow piled up and it protects existing plants that are dormant to kind of keep them and to give them an extra layer. This is now the time, which I'm sure many of you are doing some shopping online or otherwise. So start thinking now in January of what you're going to order and start to grow. This is also a good time to think about your equipment and what needs serviced. Because if you wait until March and April when the weather gets nice and you realize your blower or your mower doesn't work, you're going to wait a while to get it serviced if you got to take it somewhere. So keep that in mind for the winter months. If you have seeds, check them for viability. It's a great time too to clean your pots because, and that's what this is the stuff we do at Inniswood. We're cleaning pots and maintaining equipment And we're also doing some pruning, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And this is also a great time to start some seeds indoors. So I'm mentioning plants today. By far, they're not exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. So the plants that I'm choosing are just plants that I know have worked in whatever scenario for me and here at Inniswood, but know that there are many, many more options out there. So this is a handful of plants that I know that can be started in the winter months. And that's because they take a little bit longer to get growing, so you can get them started now. The first one is violets. The common blue violet is one of those things that people tend to dig out of their lawn. It's that kind of weedy thing that we try to get rid of. But when it has the flowers look so cute and beautiful, but the leaves don't really match our turf leaves, so we try to get rid of them. And if it's not something you're into, that's fine. But I want to tell you that you can start these seeds now. You can propagate them in other ways and certainly purchase these plants. They're perennial plants. But you can start them from seeds in the winter months. And these plants are actually beneficial because they're the host plant for fritillary butterflies, which means the baby butterflies, the caterpillars of these guys, eat the leaves on this plant. And it's actually kind of a fascinating thing. So these adult butterflies will mate in the summer, and then the female takes this really long nap. It kind of goes through diapause, and she sleeps for many weeks. And then when she wakes up, she lays eggs, not on the actual violet plant on the leaves, but just somewhere nearby. So she's like, I'm going to drop my eggs here in this area where I think would be conducive for violets to start growing. And then, crazily enough, those eggs, 2,000 of them, by the way, so many, many eggs, will hatch out, and the caterpillars sleep through winter. So they're not really doing anything that first year except becoming alive. Then in the springtime, when these plants start popping out of the ground, that's when those caterpillars start emerging as well, and they start looking for a food source. So if those two timelines don't match up, if we have caterpillars emerge before the violets emerge or vice versa, it makes it, well, vice versa wouldn't be so bad. But if you have violets out there and the caterpillars are finding them, that's great. But if those caterpillars emerge before there's any food for them, that's going to create a big loss for them. So beneficial plant. We grew lots of different dill and parsley this past year on purpose because our theme for the gardens was all about pollinators. We grew this specific type of dill, which I thought was really beautiful in the gardens. And we actually grew it more as kind of a sacrificial guy, because when you grow things in this plant family, dill, parsley, and fennel, then you attract the swallowtail butterfly caterpillars, which are quite pretty. But if you're not really a caterpillar fan, I get that. But again, remember, caterpillars are great food for birds. So what we did is we grew a whole lot of dill, and it attracted these caterpillars so that we would get those grown-up adults to help move the pollen. And so they chewed up and chewed up and chewed up the dill, and it didn't look so great. And eventually we were able to eliminate the dill, but we gave their caterpillars some food so that they could get big enough and metamorphosize into those adult swallowtail caterpillars. So they could move some pollen around and visit the flowers in the gardens. So I encourage you to do that, even if it's not something you would cook with or use. I think plants in this family are really beneficial to just providing food for the baby swallowtails. Other interesting things that you can start in the winter that actually look great most of the year. We grew this really interesting plant you see on the left-hand side of your screen that created a lot of conversation last year in the gardens. And it's Gumphocaris physocarpus, balloon flower, has lots of common names, but it's actually, we grew it as an annual plant, and it grew quite easily from seed. So we ordered some seeds, we grew it in the greenhouse. Once it was big enough and warm enough, we planted it outside. And it got to be very tall, like probably 4 feet, 3 or 4 feet tall. And this is right outside the Innis house. This is the walkway back here to the Innis house. It had these beautiful little delicate flowers, which provided lots of nectar opportunities for not just bees and butterflies. We saw all kinds of wasps and interesting beetles as well. These interesting things are the seed pods. So that's what created a lot of conversation. What are those? So that's seeds. So these are clearly some flowers that have already been pollinated. But this is one of the big reasons I liked it, is because it also is a tropical, we call it a tropical milkweed, because this is in the milkweed family, but we grew it as an annual here in Ohio because it's a southern species. It can get aggressive. There's been reports of it kind of getting out of control in Hawaii, but we grew here as an annual because it's not going to survive our winters, but it did actually become a host plant for monarchs. So we had monarch caterpillars munching away at that guy, even though it was considered one of our annual plants. We also grew this really cool cosmos, which provided a different shaped flower. So you see this kind of really delicate, loosely kind of dangling flower here. This was in the herb garden, and this was just a beautiful open flower, provided kind of a landing pad for some of our bigger pollinators. So some of the bigger bees and the butterflies that needed somewhere to hang out in order to drink their nectar. And both of those things can be started from seed in the winter, so you can be prepared to put them out in the spring or fall, or not fall, in the summer. This picture was actually taken just a few weeks ago after we got some snow. And this is a picture of the prairie garden at Inniswood. And I wanted to talk about it because this area in front looks really messy. In fact, this whole area at Inniswood looks a little messy, and we get a lot of visitor questions about it. Why aren't we kind of main? That's because we grow prairie garden plants, which are perennial plants that are tough and hardy. They're used to growing in open sun and kind of harsh environments. And a lot of those same plants we can grow as perennials in our gardens. We try very hard to leave these plants up. We don't cut them down in the fall. And that's on purpose because these can create really great homes. So the stems of a lot of these plants actually house different types of native bees through the winter. So there's certain solitary native bees that will actually lay their eggs in those stems, and that's how they overwinter. So if you, at the end of the season in fall, cut back all your perennials because you want that nice, clean, crisp look, then sometimes what happens is you eliminate the habitat for some of those native bees for a place for them to overwinter. So just encourage people to, whenever you can, tolerate that in the garden. Keep that going, because in the winter it might look like nothing's happening, but there's still a whole lot of stuff in there that is just lying dormant. It needs a place to be. Winter is a great season to do some pruning on your trees. In fact, it's a great time to notice if you have hazards. So it's a good time, a good season to just kind of take a look at some of your deciduous trees, especially. In fact, if you have oak trees, this is really the time to be pruning them. You don't want to prune oak trees when they're in like the growing season. So oak trees really should only be pruned like November through April. And that's because when you make those cuts in oak trees, you actually open that and leave a wound, which allows for different kinds of vectors to come in and move diseases. So you want to avoid that. So you want to do that when those other vectors aren't able to fly in or move in and infect those trees. So oaks especially should be pruned in the winter, but most deciduous trees can be at least evaluated and kind of cleaned up, especially for hazards like this guy, during the winter months. All right, moving into spring. Spring tasks are kind of fun, right? Like, I feel like at Inniswood, spring's like the exciting month. I mean, look at this bee. This bee is like super pumped to come in to see this crocus. In fact, I think later, I don't know if it's maybe, and Jessica can clarify, but maybe I think it's March or April. I know there's some speakers at Westerville's hosting that are going to talk about some spring ephemerals and how exciting and important and interesting they are. Now, this is crocus, which is one of the bulbs that's actually been kind of sprinkled throughout Inniswood, but it does provide a really cool early nectar source and pollen for that matter as well. So this bee's super pumped. Look at that pollen stuck on there. So spring is exciting time. You can start some more seeds. The list gets longer for the seeds that you can start to grow in this season. And you can also continue to do some pruning of some plants. So keep that in mind as we march through springtime. Spring is exciting, I think, because of all the different stuff you can start. So If you're not somebody who's like, gosh, I'm really willing and I want the really great impact, I'm going to go to the store in May and I'm just going to buy a bunch of plants and I'm going to put them in the ground. Totally fine. But if you're like, man, I really wanted to start that, and I just, a pack of seeds only cost $1, then now's the time to think about it. So in spring, that list of plants you can start from seeds gets bigger, as I mentioned. The easiest way to start seeds is just like this. Get a shallow pan, put some soil in it. It could be any sort of pan you have in your house. It could be like, I like to use the little saucers that come on the bottom of pots. I like to take those off and use them. And you just broadcast the seeds. You can see how I started some sunflowers and lettuce and carrots. Cover them up, and all of these things should germinate within a couple of weeks. So you should start to see stuff coming up out of there. So it's a pretty easy breezy way of like just kind of getting some plants started. So that way you've got some things as you move into putting stuff outside in your gardens. Now, some vegetables can be started outside. So these we consider cool season. Jessica and I were talking about that before the program started. Probably a lot of people are familiar with some of those, but these are like, think big leafy green stuff. They're going to tolerate, because they really enjoy cooler weather, but they can't freeze. So you got to make sure you're able to, if you're going to grow them outside in the spring months, that you're able to overnight cover them if there's a chance of frost.
Cindy,
here's a quick list of things that are in the state, in Ohio, in central Ohio, kind of a rough estimate of when you can put those things outside. So if you're growing lettuce, you can put that outside in mid-April, even though, it's still pretty cold at night. Make sure to cover it if you think it still could frost overnight. Potatoes can be planted in early May. Broccoli, collard greens, again, those big leafy vegetables are more likely those that are going to appreciate cooler temperatures. So those are the ones that are going to be a little bit more easy to start earlier in the season and stick them outside. Radishes are a good one. If you like radishes, we'll talk a little bit more about them.
Cindy, we do have some questions so far.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Well, somebody does ask, would the PowerPoint presentation be available after this besides the video?
I can do that if you'd like. Sure.
Okay. And then also somebody asks, Christina asks, what are your favorite sources for seeds?
Oh, I knew I was going to get this. So this is a tough one for me to talk about. My job here is an educator, so I am not the person who purchases a lot of our plants. Our horticulturist does that. So I can't speak for how we obtain plants at Inniswood. And being here an employee of Inniswood and the Metro Parks, I don't like to actually endorse or tell anybody exactly who we use. There are a plethora of opportunities and resources. In fact, I think some of your upcoming speakers would be people that I think would be better able to answer that question because they would actually be people who are growing. I know Jessica's got some people coming up maybe next month and the month after who actually own nurseries and who grow this stuff. So I think they'd be better suited to give you answers to that. So I'm sorry, I'm not really answering that question.
Somebody does ask, do you have a special soil mix to start? Or do you recommend one?
Not really. You can start any of these seeds really with any sort of soilless mix. I teach a lot of classes on container gardening, in which I talk a lot about different types of seed mixes and soilless mixes and how to make your own. But honestly, in the spring and the winter, when you're just starting seeds, any bagged mix would be fine. Don't go outside and dig stuff out of your garden. Even if the soil's soft and you think you can get it, use a sterile bagged mix. And then I would also say, even if you had some other kind of soil amendments, like if you just wanted to start seeds in vermiculite or perlite, that's totally fine too. So at this stage, when you're just starting seeds, you really just need some medium to put them in so they can germinate.
All right, thank you. And that is it for questions right now.
So here's a photo of my friend Jennifer Kleinricher. She actually created a cold frame on her farm and grows a number of things in the spring and then again in the fall. And this is her way of just an easy contraption of opening and closing should the weather get cold overnight. Again, yours doesn't have to be that elaborate. You could easily throw some seeds into a pot and cover it with a towel or a sheet at night if it gets cold enough. But just wanted to show you other options. And really, honestly, there are a number of things that quite prefer to be grown earlier in the season. So if you are a lettuce fan and you really want to be able to grow your own lettuce and have your own salads, then, in the late winter, early spring is the time to get going with that, because you're not going to have the best of luck growing lettuce in the middle of a hot summer. They're just not going to like that temperature. It's just not their season. So think about the kinds of stuff, again, that you want to grow, what your garden goals are. And if that's in it, then spring is where you want to start that. My son and I did this last year as well. We made a bunch of paper pots out of recycled paper, and then we actually used a recycled box. And that eliminated that whole like transplant seeding where I just tossed the seeds. Everything was already in these individual pots. And the fact that they were in paper, I could easily then, once these sunflowers popped out of there, I could put them then around our gardens. So that's a real easy way to start seeds, very minimal time and money put into that. So once they get germinating, then you're good to go to move them, as long as your temperatures are right. We grew sunflowers. Those sunflowers didn't really go out in the garden until mid-May, but we were able to start them even 3 or 4 weeks before that. And I liked this box idea because then I could move it inside if I needed to. So it's kind of sat on our front porch for a long time. But if I thought it was going to be too cold or too rainy, I would just haul it inside. It was movable.
Somebody is asking how you make the paper pots.
Oh, it's real easy. In fact, I'm not prepared to show you, but you can buy something that's actually called a pot maker. But here's the thing, you don't even need it. What you really need is a small soup can. So like a Campbell's soup paint can, something of that size, and some kind of long rectangular cut pieces of paper or newspaper, and you roll it and wrap the bottom. So there are a number of tutorials online, but I can also provide that information, Jessica, if there's a way to do that. We do this with most of the programming we do. If we do any sort of planting, we make our own pots, because it's just a much greener way than sending people out with more plastic. Here's our junior volunteers. So we have a group of young people that work in the gardens, mostly in the sister's garden, but they work wherever we need them. And this was unfortunately not last year because we couldn't have them come back last year, but the year before that, we planted a number of tomato plants. Now, I like to purchase tomato plants. Tomato plants can be grown from seed, and I know a number of people who have grown them successfully, but me, as a former horticulturist for a public garden, I always have trouble with it. So I quite prefer to just purchase the plants. Tomatoes are one of those that do like a really hot summer, so they're not something you're going to want to put out in the garden until later in the spring. So after that frost-free date, usually mid-May, is when you're going to want to put those tomatoes out. The thing I like about this picture is that we really wanted to try hard to encourage those bumblebees. So we planted marigolds and a couple of other flowering annuals in the same bed as the tomatoes, which is something different than I knew when I was growing up. When I was growing up on a farm, we grew rows and rows of tomatoes. We still got lots of tomatoes because clearly those bees visited, but I think we're having more and more trouble now. I know at my house, I have trouble kind of encouraging bees. Hence, remember that photo with just the 3 little cherry tomatoes? So I think when you encourage pollinators to come for a nectar source, then they're in that area so they can easily then visit those flowers on the tomatoes, because those bumblebees are the only ones that can shake their body and do that buzz pollination well enough in order to move the pollen so they can actually get tomatoes. So we had a pretty successful crop of tomatoes that year with help from our junior volunteers. I didn't want to forget about this. I've done just a few talks about microgreens, and I think it's a super fun thing. I encourage people to try it. If you're starting seeds in the spring, then you should do it, because the microgreens are basically eating baby plants. People call it vegetable confetti as well. And what you're doing is you're growing seeds, much like I just explained, either broadcast seeded or in little pots. And then you harvest them after they have their stem, cotyledons, and first set of true leaves. So, like for example, there's a stem, there's cotyledons, which are basically like the plant puts out these leaves so that they can start photosynthesizing and growing, but they always kind of look different than the actual leaves. And then they get these true leaves that look more like the actual plant's leaves. So this is radish, I think, here in the middle. And radish actually tastes pretty good. I don't really care for radishes, like the actual radish that you chop up. That's the different part of the plant. But these actually are very tasty. And I think there's a whole lot of research about how healthful they are. And they're easy to grow. Because if you're harvesting them when they're only a few inches tall, you don't need a whole bunch of space. So add them to your salads, eat them straight up. Sunflowers taste very good. What else is on that list? Cauliflower, cabbage, broccoli. Again, not a big broccoli fan, but the leaves, the baby plants of broccoli are actually quite delicious. So I encourage you to try it. Also, good time to start some of those annual seeds. You can plant all of these annuals that you see on this page. We started from seed here at Inniswood last year. We put them out in the gardens once the weather was warm enough. They became great pollinator encouragers. So we got lots of visitors there. Zinnias are always great. I encourage people to grow zinnias. Zinnias are one of those too that you can just broadcast those seeds right into your garden beds, especially after the weather's warm, usually late May. And they'll pop up, and then they will also bloom for extended periods of time. And we frequently get lots of bees and butterflies, but hummingbirds like them as well. So if you're a hummingbird fan, I encourage the zinnias. I don't have a label on that. Also in the springtime, I wanted to talk about some of the shrubs. Now, you can plant shrubs in the spring. They're obviously not going to look as mature as the ones you're looking at here, but you can also plant them in the fall. But in the spring is kind of when you start seeing some of those spring flowering shrubs and early spring flowering, early summer flowering shrubs. But these two I really liked for a couple of reasons. The first one is nannyberry, which is one of the viburnums. There's a number of viburnums that are native shrubs that have a lot of great qualities. And this one is actually bottlebrush buckeye. And I like most of the buckeyes. Obviously, I am a buckeye and we live in the Buckeye State, and they're great trees. This one grows as a shrub. It's not super tall. The flowers on it kind of look like a bottle brush, which is why it has that name. And the hummingbirds love the flowers, as well as the nannyberry flowers. And their nannyberry is actually the host plant for the hummingbird clearwing moth, which frequently visits that plant and other plants, other flowers in your garden. Now, this perennial is one of my favorites, and you may be familiar with it, maybe not. We have a few of them growing in the country garden here at Inniswood, and this is Virginia mountain mint. The mountain mint is kind of like one of those like one-stop plants. Like you are going to see a number of different critters visiting this. Just this photo shows us two very different looking bees. So if you thought all bees were the same, this photo should tell you right there that they are not the same. Just right here, we've got what looks to be some sort of honeybee and a bumblebee, and they're visiting this flower. Now these flowers are full of these tiny clusters, which create a bunch of hiding spaces and kind of little like microclimates for little critters that might want to be in there. So this plant attracts so many different things. In fact, wasps love the nectar of this plant, and they're one of the good pollinators that help move the pollen on this plant. And the thing about the wasp using this plant and visiting it for nectar is that typically by the time Virginia mountain mint blooms, our wasps are finished provisioning their nest. So they're now kind of hungry. They need carbohydrates, they need hydration. So that's why they're visiting this flower. So it kind of coincides quite nicely. It gives them somewhere for them to go to get those things that they need. Again, it's one of those timing things where it kind of works out great. But the wasp then have this flower to come visit to kind of get what it needs. Now, here's the other thing that happens. There are these wedge-shaped beetles, and I just think this is fascinating. First of all, look how cute these are. These antennae are so feathery, like so feathery and cute. But these guys are not, they're not stupid. So here's what they do. So if you're a wedge-shaped beetle, you frequently visit the flowers of the mountain mint. And if you're female, you can lay your eggs inside those flowers. Those eggs hatch into little beetle larvae. And then when things like bees and those wasps visit to get the nectar, the little larvae climb up on their bodies. Then those bees and wasps take them back to their nest. Then the little larvae, who have been just carried by some, unwillingly knowing wasp or bee, now they're back in the nest of the bee or wasp. They burrow themselves into the larva of that bee or wasp, and they eat them from the inside, which is super gross, but also great. Because here's the thing, they need to stay alive, so they know if you're this wedge-shaped beetle, that there's going to be food. If I lay my eggs here in this flower, something will come here that will take it to its food. So it's kind of fantastic if you think about it. This beetle is not necessarily pollinating, but I think that relationship is pretty exciting to me. And I was really excited to share that story because it's gross and great. Baptisia is one of my most favorite plants. This one is the native wild white. You guys might be familiar with the Baptisia australis, the more purple blue flower. Also a great perennial plant. We have a number of them here at Inniswood, but the white and the non-native. They're in the legume family, so think peas and other plants. This one is the host plant for the clouded sulfur butterfly. So again, the caterpillars are eating the leaves of this plant. And this plant's flowers tend to not open much more than you see there, which is kind of one of the reasons why it looks so great in your garden. I mean, I know I really like it. I wanted it in my wedding bouquet. I tell people this all the time because I just thought those blooms were so cool. And I liked them because they didn't quite open all the way. So if you're a bumblebee, you're very strong. You've got strong legs, you have strong mouth parts, and bumblebees are typically one of the top primary pollinators of these flowers because they are the things that are strong enough to get into the flower in order to get the pollen and move it. So they're quite important. Now, this plant is also prone to blister beetles. Blister beetles can move pollen, but quite honestly, they, again, much like that wedge-shaped beetle, they kind of know how to work this plant. So if you're a blister beetle, there's a lot of things that are visiting this plant that could be great host plants for your babies. So as adults, as a sidebar, these guys can tear up the foliage. They'll eat the foliage of these plants very readily. But also as adults, they'll lay their eggs near the nest of bees, a lot of times near sweat bee nest. And then those larvae, once they emerge from their eggs, they crawl to the nest because they're very near to it of that sweat bee. And then they actually will kind of infiltrate that sweat bee nest and they eat the other larvae. So they're very predaceous in that way. But they know that those bees are going to be visiting. So they're looking for them. But if you grow this plant, this beetle might look familiar or something of that. There's many different types of beetles, blister beetles. So that's something that might look familiar to you. The other thing that happens to this, and we've had a couple of years where we've had really high infestations of the Genista broom moth. And those caterpillars can be very gregarious. So there tends to be a lot of them all at once, and they will emerge usually in late August. And they will completely defoliate your Baptisia, but they become great bird food. So if you can deal with it, just let that year's Baptisia not look so great because the birds can come and pick those guys off. But those caterpillars do emerge and eat this like crazy. So if something like that happens, I don't have a picture of that, unfortunately, but there's another kind of moth whose caterpillars can defoliate, and that's happened here at Inniswood. But just know that usually those Baptisia, they bounce back. And by the time they come back up next spring, they're going to look great. It gives those caterpillars something to eat, and it gives the birds something to eat. I wanted to talk to you about some ground covers and climbers. So Virginia creepers, a common thing here we see in the woods here at Inniswood. You might have it at your yard or in your neighborhoods. And it's just a great plant overall. I really think that that it does a great job of covering things. It's a nice alternative to like an English ivy. And it has a lot of other good qualities. The plant on the right is the native Pachysandra. And if you're familiar with this plant, I applaud you, because I found this plant not that long ago. Remember, I've been doing this a long time, and I was like, what is that? And it was because it was blooming. This is the photo of it blooming, and I didn't recognize the flower, but this is our native Pachysandra. You might be familiar with the more rose-shaped leaved non-native Pachysandra. I have that growing around my house, and I have a 2-year-old who like drives tractors and trucks over it, and it does not die. Which is why we grow it, because we're like, oh, this is great. It's going to grow so great. But there are better choices, because that non-native Pachysandra, although it's tough and withstands the 2-year-old playing on it, it doesn't really add a lot. It's not really working for me in my garden. Like, it's not really doing much else. Like, there's no other insects attracted to it. It's not got the best blooms on it. So the native one is a better alternative. So I like to talk about that because I think it's a really cool plant. And if you can find it, I think you should try it. It also is the host plant for the creeper sphinx moth. And that's a pretty moth, but again, moths get overlooked, right? Like, we're not really looking at moths all the time. But this guy's caterpillars really need the Virginia creeper in order to stay alive. And the Carolina chickadees really benefit from the fruits of both of these guys, more the Virginia creeper than the Pachysandra. But I just thought these two were great, excellent native plants that may not contribute the best to pollination, but have a good place in your landscape. All right, so we're moving into summer. Summer's a lot about maintaining stuff. So when you're in the summer, it's a lot of weed pulling, applying mulch to suppress those weeds. You could be adding compost. It's a great time to be able to say, okay, it's now June. We can move all the things outside. You can move your house plants outside. You can plant more annuals. It's a good time then to also start thinking about invasive plants and how to control them if you have them in your garden. And depending on what's been growing, you can do some harvesting of stuff. So one of the plants I really like is buttonbush, and we have a few buttonbush here at Inniswood. So if you want to come see it in real life, I earlier last year when this plant was blooming, I posted something on our Facebook that said, do you think this is buttonbush or COVID-19? And I just wanted to put that out there, since we are still in COVID-19, that although it does kind of look like the virus, it is so much more magical. It's something we should welcome, because this plant's really, really cool. Again, it's a native shrub. It does get pretty big and it likes wet feet, so it's not for everybody's yard, but it has great things about it. It's the host plant for the Titan sphinx moth, which can pollinate, and also kind of doesn't get the praise it deserves because it's not as pretty as some of the others. But I will say that once this guy blooms, you get these wonderful flowers and lots of them. And when the pollinators find it, like this big swallowtail, they stay there for a while. And I want to talk to you about this when you watch this butterfly, because that proboscis is going into all these tiny little spots of that flower, gathering nectar, move to the next one, move to the next one, move to the next one. Now you can do this not just with the flowers on one plant, but when you grow things like zinnias or even mums in the fall, or groups of flowers that have all of the same shape, it makes them a lot more efficient at collecting nectar and pollen. So again, keep that in mind when you're grouping stuff, when you're starting to grow things. You may be like, I just really like this plant, so I'm just going to get one of them, but try to grow 2 or 3 and place them close together. And that way it's a one-stop shop. When that pollinator lands there, he knows what to do. He's going to go from one to the next, and it's going to make them a lot more efficient. So many milkweed, so little time. Everyone loves milkweed, as do I. There are so many types. I wanted to just point out 4 of them. The butterfly weed is a favorite. We had it in a number of locations last year for our theme, our pollinator paradise here at Inniswood. And it really did serve its purpose. It was a paradise for our pollinators. There's a number of different species that you can grow, and I'm sure people here on the Zoom call know way more about this than I do. I just really enjoy milkweed for lots of reasons. Mostly, this again is common milkweed. I talked about that at the very beginning. And the common milkweed, when it blooms, that flower is so fragrant that I have stopped. I'm a runner, and I have been on trails and have stopped running because that flower is just so fragrant. And usually you see patches of them. So you don't get just one flower, but you get like 40 or 50. And when the wind blows, it just smells phenomenal. And as we know, milkweeds are the host plant for the monarch butterfly. So we have that as an added benefit as well. These are the ones that get those iconic seed pods that we're all seeing, usually late summer and fall, and when we're trying to collect the seeds for them as well. But the thing with the milkweeds, I think, that is super cool, especially the common milkweed. So here's our kind of closer up picture of a flower of the common milkweed. Now, each one of these little tiny stems, they're not really stems, they have a better word, but I'm not thinking of the correct term, are individual flowers. So we're talking many, many individual flowers, right? So this picture up here is a close-up of one of those individual flowers. Again, many locations, those pollinators stop, they can go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. Bumblebees are vital for moving pollen on the common milkweed because, again, bumblebees, super strong and tough. They've got really great, strong legs, and they're really big. So if you're a tiny little sweat bee and you're entering into one of these little flowers, you could easily get caught and die. You won't be able to get out of there. Or there's a predator lurking for you, like a crab spider or some other kind of predator, and you're not going to make it out. But if you are a bumblebee, you have, and here's where you want to go, right? Because here's where the nectar is. So they've got to get into that chamber. So what we're looking at is kind of, this is the eyes of the bee. Here's the antenna. They want to collect that pollen. So that bee has to tear its way into that flower. And that bumblebee is the only one strong enough to do that. So it's super important for that bumblebee to be able to visit those flowers, because if you're anything smaller or not nearly as tough, you're going to get stuck in one of these tunnels or in this petal, and you're not going to be strong enough to get yourself out. These are beautiful trumpet-shaped flowers, all of these plants. I really like the trumpet creeper because the trumpet creeper grows pretty much anywhere. I see that growing up telephone poles and on the sides of dumpsters. I mean, I lived in Clintonville for many years, and it was always in the backyard where multiple cars parked and all kinds of trash would fill up around it, and it still grew great. Obviously, it's a great promoter of hummingbirds. Hummingbirds love that. But other long-tongued bees can sometimes visit these guys as well. And some of these are, you can notice by the words, like this one has honeysuckle in it, but it's a good one. And there are actually some good native honeysuckles. You're looking at some of them here. This page has some beautiful flowering plants as well. Shrubs, also honeysuckles. Do not plant those because those aren't native. Those are the kinds of things we're finding that are growing in all of our wooded areas. They're moving and spreading, and we're trying to get rid of them. So you might say, well, that's great, Cindy, but I will never remember that these we keep, but these we don't keep, especially if they're not blooming, right? They do have wonderful, fragrant blooms and are frequented by many pollinators, but we don't want to encourage them to continue to grow. So how do you know the difference? Especially if they're not blooming, or if you're unsure of what the leaves look like, or maybe they don't really have a lot of leaves. So it's all in the pith. The pith is this section inside the stem. So if you break open stems of what you think might be a honeysuckle, and it has a solid pith, it's one of our natives. And if it's hollow, it's non-native. So quick thing, if you're like, man, I'm pretty sure that's a honeysuckle out there, I'm not sure. Now you could go out even right now or in spring or summer, break it open and see what the inside pith looks like. It's a great summer and fall task. It's a great one. Everyone's like, yeah, so great. We spend a lot of time here at Inniswood. Our horticulture team has done an excellent job of trying to eliminate and eradicate particularly the non-native honeysuckle. And you can see here the work that our staff and volunteers have been doing. So this entire section here in front of Jane was just completely covered in honeysuckle. And we worked for weeks and weeks to dig that out. And it's important to dig it out. You can also use chemicals. But see, here's the thing, like I'm talking about honeysuckle, but you could do this in your yard with garlic mustard. We see garlic mustard in my yard all the time. It pops up and it's something to keep on. But I think it's one of those like summer, fall tasks, particularly when you're pulling out woody stuff. We spend a good amount of our summer and fall kind of continuing to get rid of this stuff because the best thing to do is to dig it out by its roots. So it has the least likely chance of coming back. Goldenrods are one of my favorites. I talk about them, I think, in the kind of the summer section of this program, but they also can bloom into fall. They're that plant that gets really kind of a bad rap because people think it makes them sneeze, but it is not ragweed. It's a different shape and it actually blooms at a different time than ragweed does. But there are many different types, and you could take many classes on how to identify all the different types, and it's fascinating, and I still am confused. Like, I'm still confused, but they're beautiful. There's also cultivated varieties, which I think are still fine and appropriate. But here's the thing with the goldenrods, they provide that late source nectar. So we're getting into like late summer and fall, and our pollinators are still looking for food. And so the goldenrod provides that. Some of the goldenrods also have really interesting relationships with insects. So if you're a giant goldenrod, you actually can grow this. If you ever see anything that kind of looks like they have swallowed a grape, that's an insect gull. So that's the goldenrod gull fly. That's the larva in there. So that fly's laid their egg in the stem and now it's growing in there. It doesn't kill that solidago, the goldenrod, it just uses it as a house. So it's a pretty cool relationship there. And another reason why, hey, like if we didn't have that kind of goldenrod, then we wouldn't have those flies because they only live there on that plant. Now, the other thing about goldenrods I want to talk about is that they have very specific relationships with different kinds of bees. So most bees tend to visit lots of different flowers that are lots of different sizes and shapes, and they collect pollen that's also different sizes and shapes. But there are some bees, some mining bees, especially some smaller ones, that are oligolectic, which means that they have very specific ways of collecting pollen. So if they're a bee that actually has like pollen baskets on the sides of their body, they might not be able to hold or grab onto pollen that is an incorrect size or shape, which means that they are uniquely attached to the specific flowers of specific types of goldenrods, because that's the kind of pollen that their bodies are able to take with them to utilize. So they have very specific relationships. Again, it's one of those like, hey, if we didn't have that kind of goldenrod, we wouldn't have those kinds of bees, because that's the only way they're getting their food. I wanted to talk all about these great perennial plants that look awesome in the summer and fall. There's a number of different types of these composite type flowering plants. And really, like, I think the cool thing about these is that they have the big open petals. So these are the kind of showy flowers that are going to get some of the more showy types of pollinators. But they also get these guys. This is actually a fly. It's a syrphid fly, has 2 wings, giant eyes. But upon first glance, you might think it's some sort of wasp, right? It's a kind of a mimic of wasp and bees, and that's on purpose. It will move pollen, so it's very attracted to lots of plants in this plant family. But the cooler thing about this is that their babies, their larvae, which is this really beautiful looking creature here, is very predaceous. So if you see these syrphid flies, likely they have had their babies, their larvae, somewhere nearby on that same plant. And those larvae are eating things like this guy right here is an aphid. So if you got aphids or other types of homopteran insects that are infesting your plants, then these types of flies are kind of super beneficial for you because they actually have little like spears on the end of their mouth parts. So they'll like spear their little guys, their aphids, and eat them. See, it's kind of gross. I'm glad we're doing this after lunch, but great information.
Cindy, I do have a question from Deb.
Oh.
She says most of these pollinators look like they need a sunny spot to grow, or the plants. I have mostly shaded areas. Any suggestions?
Yeah, so I think here's the thing. Remember when we talked about the violets? Violets are not going to grow in big, open, sunny areas either. So the best way that you can contribute to pollinators and having that habitat and food for them is to think about growing things that are going to be host plants for those caterpillars. So you're right. I didn't actually mention a whole lot of things that grow in more shady areas. And I could probably provide some information about that later, maybe a list of some plants. Because I don't want to throw out too many off the top of my head, but most people who have shade gardening have lots of challenges anyway, right? So if you have big trees, you like trees, but you're like, man, I don't really know what to grow underneath. Remember we talked about some of those vines and ground covers, which have a lot of benefit to your garden as well. So I would think more along those lines because those are going to both grow. Pachysandra and that Virginia creeper are going to grow nicely in a shaded area. But I do think that there is better opportunities for you to assist in providing food for those caterpillars in some of those shadier spots than the flowers. Because you're right, most of these blooming plants that we're talking about are needing a lot of sun. Here's another one that needs a bunch of sun. This is the cup plant, and it grows in, we have a patch of it here at Inniswood next to the wetland and a couple other places. And I like it because the flower itself actually it attracts kind of like short-tongued bees, so more like sweat bees because of the flower shape. You don't have to dig so deep into the flower to get the nectar. But this plant has, this unique cup shape. The leaves wrap around the stems, which provide little habitats for other critters. This tree frog is not going to pollinate anything, but having that diversity and lots of different types of animals in your garden is only beneficial to you. Now, I will also mention that we incorporate a lot of tropical plants in our seasonal beds here at Inniswood, and they did great things for our pollinators last year. So this one was Colocasia coffee cups, and it was a beautiful plant and grown mostly for its foliage, and it's like funky tropical feel, but it did this great thing that collected water here and created a real nice puddling opportunity for a lot of butterflies. So butterflies tend to do that. They visit places that have water like puddles in order to lap that up if they need some extra hydration. And so it works as a kind of natural way to provide extra water for your mostly butterflies, but other pollinators might as well. All right, moving into fall. If you've been fertilizing, stop it. Now, I like fertilizer. I think fertilizing is good, but I think if you think fertilizing is absolutely necessary, maybe you need to switch things up, because in order for plants to grow, they need sunlight and water. They don't need fertilizer. Fertilizer is an added thing. So in the fall, stop doing that. It's a great time to do some more harvesting, gather seeds. You can take cuttings of plants and start growing them indoors. This is a good time to do another round of seasonal or cool season crops. So remember in the spring, we started those kind of leafy greens. You can do that again in the fall. You get a whole nother crop of lettuces and shards and kales. This is the time to plant those spring bulbs, move your house plants, do some composting. And don't forget to move your clay pots in. If you have clay pots, move them inside because the freezing and thawing of winter will cause them to crack. I just want to talk quickly about a couple of trees that I think about in the fall. Birches are great native trees, and they have a cool relationship with more caterpillars, so more bird food. Look at that juicy guy. It's really juicy. So again, you might not want that on your trees, but know that in the fall, these guys are building cocoons that in the spring will emerge this beautiful Polyphemus moth. The cocoons, though, will attach to the stems of the trees, and they'll either hang on the trees or they'll fall next to it in the leaf litter. So in the fall, it's really important to pay attention to what you do with your leaves. So I encourage people to keep your leaves, pile your leaves up under the trees or in your garden beds if you can handle it, because there's usually a lot of kind of forgotten cocoons and chrysalises that are hanging on those trees, that need a place to overwinter. So if you're bagging your leaves and getting rid of all your leaf litter, then you're also getting rid of these guys and you won't see them in the spring. And then, of course, I had to mention oak trees. Oak trees, as we know, Doug Talamy has been teaching for years. Oak trees are a host plant for more than 300 different types of caterpillars. So there's a lot of really good benefits to growing oak trees. They also encourage other insects like katydids and stag beetles. And they have what I love are a bunch more insect galls. We talked about that with the solidago, but you see these kind of funky growths all over the leaves and the stems of oaks. And typically that just means that there is usually a baby or eggs of some other kinds of insect, like a wasp or a midge. And they're just using the oak as a nice home to get through the season. So usually it does not any damage to the oak at all, just kind of makes it look kind of funky. And then in the fall, great fall color comes from our native poison ivy. So I encourage you, if you have poison ivy and can handle it, you don't want to get near it, but you can keep it. It does provide a great source of flowers for pollinators, but also fruit for birds. So I always talk about that because it gets a bum rap, I think, in terms of, some cool plants for your garden. But seriously though, like, why are we so concerned about pollinators and planning for them? Again, pollination is very vital. So it gives us fruits that we can eat and seeds that give us more plants. And those more plants give us more oxygen. And I don't know about you, but I don't really know anybody who needs less oxygen. So in the end, it's a win-win. Like, I think we just need to focus on any little tiny bit of things that we can do to encourage the habitat for them. I think we should. Don't forget to inch your way through here. Remember, these little guys, pro leg by pro leg, even if you're dragging your pro legs like this poor little geometer moth, we're going to get through this year little by little. Small garden goals, big garden goals. I think we can do it. And I'm really, really excited for the opportunity. I wanted to just mention also that, we are excited at Inniswood for another year of gardening. We're in the full swing of planning again, and the hopes that this year will bring even more and new visitors and plants. I also wanted to mention that these are a few of the books that I really like. In fact, I kind of I've taken this one. I need to buy my own copy. But Heather Holmes' Pollinators of Native Plants is a great book. And I used a lot of the information in her book for today's program. It's organized in a real nice way. And I encourage you to check it out if you're interested in pollinators at all.
Cindy, I also have a question from Maud. He says, how has global warming affected the pollinator plants?
Well, again, I think it goes back to global warming, or that climate that is increasing in temperatures changes how and when plants emerge and bloom. And when that changes, that then affects different creatures and species, right? So, a couple of examples of that we talked about, like with the violets, right? If our violets aren't available when those fritillary caterpillars are coming out, then we're going to lose, thousands possibly of that specific species. So that's just one example. But I think in general, to answer that question, it would be more of the timing aspect. So as we know, the climate changes, it changes the timing schedule of our plants blooming and emerging, which affects a whole lot more than we usually think of.
Right, and I do have a question. Do you have a recommendation for bird feeder placement in terms of nearness to plants and flowers, especially if they're going to eat the pollinators?
Oh, so you mean, like, do you think is the question more like the Oh, I see what you mean. So if the birds are going to eat the pollinators, but you want to encourage the birds. Yeah, I don't know that there's any real placement that I would say should be discouraged. Here's the thing I think about for bird feeding. I think bird feeding is very important for birds starting like January through March and April. Particularly March and April, birds are hungry. They're kind of like still, that's the tail end of winter. They've been really trying to manage for many months now. That's a really important time. I tend to not feed the birds or as much and often once the weather starts getting warmer and we start seeing blooming plants. So I think that your bird feeding is less important once your plants are coming into play because now you have kind of like natural habitats where their food is already growing and you're not having to supplement their diet.
Thank you. Also, for anybody who might be doing any kind of container gardening inside, do you have a recommendation on, because if the plants are inside your house, then there's probably not a pollinator inside your house except for you. So can you give maybe a couple of quick tips on how to self-pollinate a houseplant?
Oh, well, I think it's very dependent on the plant itself. So if, I mean, it would be really exciting if you have, here's the thing. I think some plants are self-pollinating, so easy to move pollen from one flower to the other flower. Others may need multiple plants, and others might need just more time. So it's hard to answer that in a real general way, just because it's very plant specific. So once you know what the plant is, I think having the information about what that plant is will help determine how to pollinate it, because if it's something that needs a bee specifically to pollinate it, that's going to be a little bit different technique than if it's something that multiple insects could move the pollen on it.
Thank you very much. All right. If you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen at this. Well, if that is it, then we will go ahead and wrap up. Cindy, once again, thank you very much for taking your time and, lending us your expertise in these dark winter months for happier months on the horizon. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you guys for joining us. I had such a great time.
So again, thank you very much for coming and look forward to future gardening programs.